who I've been very lucky over the last 12 years to learn from, to work with, and to fight with. I'm going to do some incredibly quick introductions because we only have half an hour and we've got 3 amazing panellists. So you can Google them later, you can talk to them later, find out more about them. My name's Katie. I'm an architect based here in Darwin, currently working in the housing policy team with the Northern Land Council. I'm joined today by Glenn Marshall from the Centre for Sustainability of
Sustainable Darug Counties.
Thank you. I can see the acronym, but I can't remember the words. Joe Best from Tropo Architects and Ray Mahoney from CSI Road. And really what we're here to talk to you about today is climate resilience. As everyone here would know, the Northern Territory is really on the forefront of climate change with rising temperatures and extreme weather events that we've seen with a lot of the flooding this year already. And as we heard from our neighbours in New Zealand who were also talking about this morning. And I think what we understand is that houses in remote communities already struggle to withstand our existing climate. We also saw yesterday Dan Kelly speak about the lawsuit brought on by the residents of Papunya in terms of the rising heat there and the inability of the houses to sort of manage that. So we're 2 years into a 10-year, $4 billion agreement, and we're seeing many more houses getting built. But what we really want to ensure is that they are meeting that standard that Dan referred to as reasonable comfort. Not only now, but also into the future. So we're just going to focus today on exploring some design processes and interventions, what we keep talking about in conversations, particularly with my Land Council colleagues, about the low-hanging fruit. What are things that could be implemented to improve the climate and resilience and thermal comfort of houses in remote communities and homelands? I'd also just like to do a quick shout out to Phoebe Snett from CLC who pulled us all here today to talk to you. So I would say, in terms of our constituents, you want to try the mic now?
Yeah, sweet, thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Woohoo! I don't have to yell anymore. I can relax. Okay. So I would say, in terms of our constituents, the most common feedback we get is more housing on homelands and engage with Aboriginal people more. So I'm going to throw to Joe first. And I'm wondering, Joe, if you can speak about, I know that you often advocate for early and continued engagement with clients, particularly First Nations people who'll be impacted by projects. And I'm wondering if you can speak to maybe some of the experiences or successes you've seen that early and continued engagement plays, particularly in incorporating passive design principles.
Sure, thank you. So I guess one of the things that is most common when you're out on community is that a lot of people just haven't seen any other alternative than what the Northern Territory government rolls out from the islands to the desert, and you are constantly being reminded of how people are trying to make these buildings, which are completely inappropriate in form and materiality, work in the environments where they live. They're inappropriate in terms of cultural sensitivities and the need to consider who is being housed and at what time of year. And I guess there's just sort of this idea propagated, a lie propagated by the government that there's only one answer to a type of house because it's only going to be destroyed anyway. So once that idea is put to the side and people are given an opportunity to talk about, you know, why it is that they're building bough shelters in their backyard and how that performs better than the house that they've been given, and so that's why they spend all of their time in those sorts of, in those, building those places and being in those spaces rather than the housing that's provided to them, then it just opens up opportunity around what's the right answer.
Thank you. I think that segues nicely into my next question, which was, we know that because housing in remote communities is public housing, there's always a need to standardise it. And I'm curious from anyone on the panel, what are some design features you would specifically like to see either in the tropics or the arid wherever appropriate.
If we're talking about arid zone, which is where most of my work's been, and most of my work's been with existing housing, the quickest, easiest, cheapest way to achieve better thermal performance is paint the roof a light colour, put in ceiling insulation, shade walls that get a lot of sun, and in the desert, give the ability for houses not to be drafty. They're the four things. Even on a blockwork house that I could take you to blockwork houses in Laramba community, which were built in the late 80s and early 90s. Very simple designs, just rectangular shape, 3 bedrooms, two of those bedrooms up the western side of the house on the short wall, but with full western sun and only a 600mm eave, so they get western sun all afternoon. Temperature sensing, monitoring inside those 2 bedrooms. Those bedrooms in summertime, those blockwork walls will be radiating 30-degree heat back into those bedrooms. And what it means is that those 2 bedrooms are empty over summer. So you turn a 3-bedroom house into a 1-bedroom house by doing that. And people generally respond in 2 ways. They'll either, if there is a aircon in the main living room, people will all move into the main living room, which comes with issues of, one person's got a cold, suddenly everyone's got a cold, or people will move outside, which is a very common response in summertime. Those houses, I've managed those houses for quite a while. We were just putting $3,000, built by local people, just putting a skin wall on the western side, which is basically, it's a veranda coming out, but you've put it down onto the face of the wall. So you put a bit of top hat, which is about that far off the wall, then you just screw some light coloured tin sheets to it, and it acts as a shade onto that blockwork wall, and it brings the temperatures in those houses down in those bedrooms down by about 5 or 6 degrees, and people suddenly are back in those bedrooms. Maybe not at the absolute peak of summer, but in those shoulder seasons where they're not in those rooms, they're back in those rooms. Really, really simple solutions to existing housing. And these are houses that, that particular example I told you, we did that in about 2012. And those houses were built in 1992, So for 30 years, people lived in those houses with really hot bedrooms that they didn't live in summer. And we were able to really help them with literally 2 days of local blokes screwing some sheets onto a western wall. Really easy.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Did you want to add to that, Josie?
I was just going to say, I think, the same applies to the top end in terms of it's not rocket science. These are basic principles that we're talking about in terms of how to make a building thermally comfortable. And those design principles were applied for hundreds of years before the aircon came along, and everyone lived very happily because the house was the machine, yeah? The whole thing worked as a system. It wasn't just about one thing that you could stick to the outside of it and make it work. And I guess, when we're talking about building in places where there isn't energy security or where people are constantly, running out of money on their power card, a good design is going to help that place be more comfortable for a greater time of the year. And hopefully all year long. And those basic principles of a big hat that shade all the walls and all the openings, that allow for spaces around the edge of the house to be used as well, and a long thin plan that is orientated for prevailing breezes that allow the breeze to come through the house. And as much as the energy efficiency legislation tells you a leaky house is bad, if you don't want an aircon on it, the leaky house is exactly what you want. And I'm not talking leaky from water, I'm talking leaky from air. So, there's plenty of examples of houses out on communities, like the beautiful houses at Jinka made from locally made mud bricks from Menangrida, that mud bricks to 800 high, and then it's just fly screen above that, and they are the coolest houses you've ever been in your life. The stone houses down at Barrapunta made from the stone from the, ground, basically. None of these places have any aircon, and they are far superior to anything that I've ever seen the Northern Territory Government roll out.
Ray, I know you didn't want to take up too much spotlight because you're speaking immediately after this, but
Thanks.
I feel like you probably have some further insights to offer to these 2 comments.
Thanks. Ray Marnie. from CSIRO. I'm a researcher, sometimes scientist, so I don't have the excellent, professional and personal experience that my fellow panel members have. I live in Brisbane, so, coming to community, like some of the communities people here work with is, me getting on a plane, being in Qantas Club, getting on a plane and coming over. So I certainly can't speak from personal experience. What I can talk about also is that in addition to my role at CSIRO, I'm also a board director on our local co-op, which is an Aboriginal housing co-op in the Bayside of Brisbane. So I'm very familiar with the challenges around community housing from a personal and community point of view. But really what I wanted to sort of highlight is that...
Ray's just got to log back in so you can see his data.
Is that what people have been talking about aligns with the literature, the evidence that we looked at in our work with Tangentyere, which will make up the next half hour. And please stay, because it's a very excellent presentation with my two colleagues, Vanessa and Michael. But when we were approached or partnered with Tangentyere to look at the thermal comfort of housing in town camps, as researchers and scientists, we looked at the literature, and the literature that is out there backs up exactly what people have talked about here, and they say that the four main factors that contribute to the thermal environment is temperature, humidity, heat radiation, and air movement. So the evidence backs up what most people here know about. But it was really interesting and compelling for us when we looked at the literature that they described 3 levels of thermal comfort or 3 levels of thermal conditions. And that's optimal thermal conditions equal to thermal comfort, permissible thermal conditions equal to thermal discomfort, and unacceptable thermal conditions. And I guess put it simply, optimal is where you can carry out normal duties without any undue strain or fatigue, right? Now, I'm not sure if that's the case for many people who live in those sorts of housing that, you can just get around and do normal stuff without fatigue. And as a health, public health researcher, and it's my area, I mean, you put people in an environment where they're in constant fatigue and heat stress, that exacerbates chronic disease and a whole range of other health factors, shortens people's life expectancy. And then you add to it power disruption, and that impacts on food security and security of medication and those things. So, I mean, yeah, there's so many very important things we need to do beyond just, thinking about the housing and the impact it has.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the thing is that a building, a house, a centre like this, they're all complex machines, as Joe was saying, and some of them take a long time, from the very first inception of idea of like, I want a house in this place to actually moving in. And I'm wondering if, and anyone on the panel can jump in on this, of how do we continue to foster innovation and develop creative solutions, at these moments, while also being mindful of some of the practical challenges of building in the NT? How do we make, best practice meet the reality of some of the real challenges we have building, particularly in these remote locations?
Geez, my opinion on that is that we don't need best practice, we need adequate practice, because these things cost so much to build. If you're building a Rolls-Royce model, that's not what, when I talk to people out bush, they want a house, but they don't want something that's absolute Rolls-Royce. They just want something that works. And that might mean some compromises. Doesn't need to be compromised like leaving your west wall fully blazing sun. I mean, that's just stupid. But it doesn't need to be perfect, There's plenty of blockwork houses in Central Australia built in, as I say, late 80s and early 90s, which are still really functional houses. They've been seriously renovated a couple of times, but to renovate that house costs $200,000 rather than to buy a new one build a new one at $900,000. So, aside from the petrol sniffing era in the 90s, where people would literally sit there and chip away at the walls of blockwork houses all day and destroy that house, they're robust beasts, you know. But we've got issues of thermal performance, but they can be managed well enough that people, you know, if people do have to move out of their bedroom for 3 or 4 weeks in January, February when there's really hot patches and they sleep outside, that's not unusual for people to do. It's not great, but people seem to be willing to accept that, to be able to have that house, to be there, you know.
That idea of migrating around the house at different times of day or year, I think is something that, you know, needs to apply to any housing everywhere. But I think when you're talking about what the answer is, like, again, it's like people are understanding exactly that there is no reason why they can't mobilise and educate themselves in terms of how to deliver the houses that they need, and that is always going to be a better answer than what the government is able to provide through public housing, because it's going to be specific to that need. And I guess when you think about it from the government's perspective, they're just looking at it from like, oh, how do we do it as cheaply as possible and make it as generic as possible? But that doesn't not work just from a climatic perspective and the different climate zones we've got in the Northern Territory, but it doesn't work from the perspective of different ways that people want to live. And I guess, like, it's got to be more specific to need, and so that people are engaged in the process of design, they're engaged in the process of construction. There's been plenty of examples in the past where delivery also included training, which meant that people had the ability to maintain houses for longer periods of time. And there's stuff that Chopo did over at Gallowinku, like in the 90s, that have been through cyclone after cyclone. They're all elevated houses, they're all lightweight, they've all got glass louvers in them, and every single one of them is still standing to this day. Like, the people that live in them have been there from the day they moved in, and their families have continued to occupy those houses, and they love them. And that sense of ownership and pride of that house is essential to how that, like, is an example of how that model provides a long-term answer.
Because we were talking before, weren't we, Joe, about when I go to communities and I talk to men about what are the things that you've been really happy participating in your community here, and always if there's houses that have been built by local people there, that's the first thing they'll point to. They go, "We built that pink house there." You know, all those other ones we just had to sit and watch contractors do it, but we built that house there. It's such a source of pride for people.
We're already running out of time, and I want to open the floor to any questions from people in the audience. Don't worry, I've got more, but I, don't want to take up all the time.
Hi there. Well, thanks for that. It's been very informative. I just want to say we don't have a housing crisis. What we have is a greed and corruption crisis, and probably cumulative errors, because they just keep trying to work with a system that's not functional. What we need is to make sure that we start feeding this research back into the powers that be and say, look, just admit you got it wrong, and let's start with fixing the problem instead of putting bandages on. Some of the things that I'm concerned about is like the over-regulation sometimes, and the speculation and all those things that made the housing prices just become unaffordable for a lot of people. So we've just got to address the problem and start dealing with those people. And then and the other thing is the affordability. So using local materials. So as a scientist, we can't get things insured. You can't get a loan. So you got all these other barriers before you even start thinking about buying a house. So we need to identify those things and start tackling those. And maybe housing is a necessity of life. It shouldn't be a commodity. And if they want to divide the market up so that you can have your rich people's playground, and then just give people the necessities of life, so that we can stop the banks from basically sucking the life out of the nation.
So, Michael, that's a national issue, of course. That's not restricted to Aboriginal people. My own kids, I don't know how they're going to buy a house. It's so damned expensive. One thing that I can give you experience on that governments could implement tomorrow is you look at a remote Aboriginal community in Northern Territory, let's leave homelands alone for now. In those communities, government spends 95% of the money that's spent in those places, right? And they build new houses. And I don't know the last couple of years, but certainly up until the last couple of years ago, no independent quality control of installations, right? It was all self-certification by whether it's the builders or the plumbers or whatever. And the implications of that are extreme for communities. I'll give you an example. In Bloodowitch community on the Sandover Highway, they're Aliara speaking people. They had troubles with septic systems for decades, right? They had mature aquatic ecosystems in people's yards where septics had been bubbling out of the ground for so long that there was actual aquatic species living in there. Seriously, I humbugged government for years, because that's one of my expertises is septic upgrades. And for years, for me and a trusted plumber to go out there and have a look, and they finally said, yeah, okay, go and do that. And people were talking about, oh, the soil's different out here, and so, it's never going to work. We went out there, we had a backhoe, we scratched up 45 houses, scratched up the yards of those just to get a sense of what was going on. And where you have to put in absorption trenches on the end of septic tanks so that you can soak away the water after it comes out of a septic, what the code length said it should be, they averaged 1/3 of what the code length said it'd be. And that was one plumbing contractor out of Tennant Creek in particular who'd done most of that work. Over 15 years had put those things in. Virtually every single time had been paid for a full system and put in a third. And so, of course, those things filled up and then bubbled up to the surface. Now, that's an issue very easily resolved by government actually going back to the good old days, 30 or 40 years ago, where you employed crusty old plumbers who don't do plumbing anymore to go around for government and do the quality control checks. And plumbers remember very quickly how to do plumbing by the code once they've got a boot up their arse. I can tell you that right now. And that particular Bloodowitch example, we costed that at $1.1 million to fix that plumbing. So that's money you should never have had to spend. And normally when I do quality control work as an independent quality control person on a contract, it's about 3% of the value of the contract. So you can guarantee your 97% is spent well by paying 3% for an independent person, which doesn't happen a lot at the moment. Now, of course, what happened was that Alison Anderson was the minister at the time. She put $1.1 million up from Bloodowitch to be fixed. I kept saying to the Department of Housing, for goodness sake, get me on to do quality control, and they didn't get me on to do quality control. And the job was done, and we're right back to where we were. People going, oh, the septics aren't working any good. That's something that could happen immediately, that government, which spends so much money out there, could just set up their own quality control systems internally again, and you'll find every tradie suddenly remembers how to do that work well. Guaranteed.
We've got 30 seconds left, so I'm going to challenge the panel to just incredibly quickly just touch on, if we want to improve the thermal performance and climate resilience of existing houses, the ones that have already been built, is that like a whole, retrofit of a house, or can that be, in some cases, can there be some cheap and cheerful solutions there?
I'll start. Yes, I think so. The only thing I'll also add is it's also about decision making, having community in that genuine decision making position across a whole lot of things, especially housing.
If we're talking about the bog standard blockhouse in the top end, then ensuring that there is no direct solar access to those walls and openings, exactly as Glenn did on that west-facing wall down in the desert, would greatly improve performance. But it's also about trying to create more of that cross breeze through the house so that you have air moving all the time.
And I've already said it. Paint your roof a light colour, put in ceiling insulation, shade your walls, and stop drafts in Central Australia in winter when people are really trying to close their houses up to not be cold. It's so simple.
Look, and you might have already said it, but as everyone here knows, it never hurts to hear it again because it's incredibly beneficial and useful information. As you can hear, this panel is a wealth of experience and information. I highly encourage you to chat to these people if they're, I know you two are hanging around, I don't know if you're hanging around. But yeah, please chat to these people and just thank you so much for listening.